I remember back in 2014, back when it was announced that the new movies wouldn't follow the expanded universe. People were so excited. There were so many comments about how glad they were that the EU wasn't canon anymore, and that persisted for a long time. The expanded universe got dumped on everywhere, and EU fans were told to get over it and move on. We got new movies coming out. Funnily enough, I now see a lot of people talking about how great the EU was and how much they miss it. The grass is always greener on the other side, apparently, and some who were once excited by the EU going away have been fairly disappointed in the new canon. I'm not speaking for everyone, of course. There are lots of fans of the new canon, and there always will be. Many of which are still glad the EU, or at least parts of it, are gone. Like Tanner Fox, who wrote this article on WhatCulture.com, titled 10 Weird Expanded Universe Things We Are Glad Aren't Canon Anymore, with the tagline, "Sometimes it's better when history becomes legend." I wanted to go over this list of 10 things Tanner didn't like about the EU, and I'll put a link for it in the description. I don't have any problem with people who dislike the EU. I just like to know the reasons why they feel that way. It's always interesting to go over arguments from people on the other side of the fence and see whether or not I agree with them. I previously looked at similar lists from HelloGreedo and Sean Buckley. I'll put links in the description for those videos in case you're interested in checking them out. Anyway, let's get started. Tanner writes, Disney's acquisitions of the Star Wars property in 2014 held both great and terrible implications for longtime fans of the franchise. On one hand was the guarantee that Lucas would never again pollute his creation with more abominable prequel movies or unnecessary special editions. Yet on the other hand, there was an entire generation of ancillary Star Wars content that would have to be dealt with before Disney could move the series forward. First off, Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012, not 2014, but that's a minor point. But right off the bat, I don't quite agree with Tanner's definition of what constitutes a great implication for Disney Star Wars. Though it's a controversial opinion, I really love the prequel movies. They have their flaws, of course, and as far as the special editions go, yeah, some changes I didn't really care for. But other decisions, like improving the visuals, I thought helped overall. But I do somewhat agree with what Tanner calls a terrible implication, which would be decanonizing and discontinuing the EU. At this point, I don't really have a problem with the EU being non-canon. I don't want the EU to be part of what Lucasfilm currently considers canon. I want Legends and Disney's canon to be as separate as possible. But I do think both continuities should have more content added to them. As a result, decades of comic books, novels, and video games, collectively referred to as the Star Wars Extended Universe, was decanonized so new studios wouldn't have to worry about tiptoeing around old obscure lore. Though this meant that epics like Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy of novels would become little more than aggrandized fanfiction, it also meant that a ton of awful schlock would be getting the axe. They got rid of the EU, so studios wouldn't have to worry about tiptoeing around it. But by doing so, they have a whole list of new issues they have to deal with. With a movie coming out every year, they have to deal with movie writers contradicting each other. And if one of those writers don't appeal to Kathleen Kennedy's liking, they get fired. This has happened so much that writers are actually turning down offers to work on Star Wars. And as for the new books and comics, though supposedly they got rid of their tier system that helped organize the old canon, movies still reign supreme under the new system, and book and comic creators can't produce anything too epic or game-changing because they might step on the toes of the lore established by a new movie coming out or something. EckhartsLadder talks about this in more detail in one of his videos. With the EU, all book and comic creators had to do was collaborate and talk with each other, or Lee and Chi if they wanted to write a story, and they were allowed a lot of freedom, because George Lucas didn't necessarily want to tell every little detail about the universe. He would leave events that happened before, during, or after the film saga up to the expanded universe authors. Since George never really had any concrete plans to make an Episode 7, they were allowed to go beyond Episode 6, and tell us what happened with Han, Luke, and Leia. Like the Thrawn trilogy that Tanner just mentioned, for example. And even though it's non-canon now, calling it fanfiction is a bit of a misnomer, because it's still officially owned and sold by Lucasfilm. Just be careful of what you call fanfiction, because I can make the same arguments that the sequel trilogy is just aggrandized fanfiction, because the original creator isn't involved anymore. The EU, now referred to as Star Wars Legends by Disney, has a reputation for ridiculous plot threads and totally unnecessary stories, from evil clones to invading extragalactic alien races, to the poorly written deaths of beloved characters. here are a few things from the expanded universe that we're glad are no longer considered canon. So, while it is a little ridiculous, I'm not sure what is totally unnecessary about evil clones or extragalactic alien races. Those seem pretty par for the course in the Star Wars universe. I'm also not sure which beloved characters he's talking about that had a poorly written death, but we'll get there soon enough, I'm sure. So, on to the countdown. Number 10. Masters of Teräs Käsi. Star Wars Masters of Teräs Käsi was a terrible attempt to merge the galaxy far, far away with the tournament fighter video game genre. Though the property seems perfect for such an adaptation, Masters of Teräs Käsi was one of the most disliked original PlayStation games ever to release. You're absolutely right. Masters of Teräs Käsi was a pretty mediocre fighting game. In my opinion, all it really has going for it is the novelty of fighting as Star Wars characters. And while it does have a pretty decent selection of fighters, even Mara Jade and Jodo Kast, it doesn't do a very good job with the controls or gameplay. That being said, I don't really know why you would be glad it's non-canon. Like I said, mediocre game, but there was hardly a story within the game outside the text crawl. If this game had an abysmal story, then I would understand why it'd be on this list. But there's nothing really there. Palpatine hires a martial arts expert, Arden to assassinate Rebel Alliance members. And that's it. That's all the justification used to make it a fighting game. Other than that, this game pretty much exists to have characters like Han Solo fight Boba Fett, or Chewbacca up against Darth Vader. If you want more detail about the story elements of this game, check out the Star Wars Gamer article, The Emperor's Pawns, where it goes a little more in depth about Arden, though players should have been treated as spectacular semi-fanfiction battles between characters like Darth Vader, Darth Sidious, Luke Skywalker, Yoda, and so on. These fights were made ridiculous by the fact that lightsabers in the game were about as effective as harsh language, bouncing off even totally unprotected combatants, while doling out a very minor damage penalty. It made the series' most iconic weapon a total joke. So, actually, Yoda and Darth Sidious were not playable in the game. And the lightsabers are helpful for the characters who use them, as they offer a little more range, but obviously, since this is a fighting game, they don't function how lightsabers would in the movies. Otherwise, they would be way too overpowered, as you could just hack body parts off your opponent with most of them not being able to defend themselves. I agree about the lightsaber being able to be blocked by a character's bare arms. Doesn't make any sense. But at the end of the day, it's just game mechanics, and not meant to be taken literally. I mean, in Mortal Kombat, when you pull off a special X-ray move, some of those should realistically end the fight right there. But all it really does is decrease the other fighter's health bar. If they still have enough health, they just continue fighting as if their ribcage didn't just explode. But like I said, those are just game mechanics. A fighting game just doesn't do justice for how a lightsaber operates. If you want to see a game that shows how lightsabers should really work, check out the Jedi Knight games with Kyle Katarn. What's more, most of these characters, including Arden and Hor the Tusken Raider, were made up for the game. What could possibly be worse than going toe-to-toe with the Dark Lord of the Sith unarmed? Going up against him as a Tusken Raider with a ridiculous name. Yeah, his name sounds silly. I'll give you that, but this is a nitpick at best. There still aren't any story elements that you've critiqued yet, and silly names are present in the new canon too. I think that's just how Star Wars will always be. This PS1 flop is non-canon, though the fighting style referenced in the game made a small appearance in the recent Solo film. Could this mean EA will soon be rolling out a sequel? Hopefully not. Well, no, they're not going to make a canon sequel to a game that's non-canon. The best they could do is remake the game with better mechanics, but I don't think people are really asking for that either. If you want a good Star Wars fighting game, check out the multiplayer mode for the Revenge of the Sith game. Number 9. The Death of Chewbacca. Published in October of 1999, Star Wars Vector Prime was an entry into a series of post-Return of the Jedi novels which explored a galactic invasion orchestrated by the Yuuzhan Vong, an alien species originating from outside the Star Wars galaxy, which harbored an intense hatred for technology. Though a pretty neat concept in theory, many fans totally despise the storyline. Han and Chewie were caught up in a desperate attempt to evacuate the planet of Cern Padal before it could be destroyed by the Vong. However, as their crew struggled to escape before their enemies flung a moon into the planet, Chewbacca made a heroic effort to save Han's son, Anakin Solo, which ultimately resulted in him being stranded on the planet. Killing off a mainstay Star Wars character is a guaranteed way to get on the top of fans' naughty lists, and Vector Prime was, at best, extremely controversial when it released. Though it may have had a few stalwart supporters, most fans of the franchise are likely to be thrilled that the expiration date on everyone's favorite Wookiee has been lifted. You say the series had most fans despise it, and it has only a few stalwart supporters. But I don't know if that's true. Sure, it was a pretty controversial series, and introduced a lot of new concepts, and Chewbacca got killed off, and a lot of people were pretty mad about it. But I think looking back at it, it was probably a good decision. Before New Jedi Order, the New Republic era was getting a little samey. Each book would deal with a new villain of the week, and our heroes would have to come in and stop them. While it was fun, it was also a little too safe, and when you're not worried that the heroes might die, then the stakes aren't really there. Having one of the main characters die in the first book of the series lets people know that none of the heroes are safe. But Chewie didn't die for no reason. It set the tone for the rest of the series, and you described Chewbacca dying to save Anakin Solo in a very heroic manner. Sacrificing your own life to save someone else is the most heroic thing you can do. And as a Chewbacca fan, I think that going out in a blaze of glory is a very respectful tribute to that character. For the new canon, I'm sure people are glad that he was in the movie, but then you also have other big main characters get killed off, in far less heroic ways. And I guess Chewbacca is still there, only after Han is gone, he's teaming up with this girl they just met. I prefer Chewbacca's story in Legends, even if it means that he died. He still died a hero, and it took a whole moon to do it. Number 8. Skippy the Droid. Skippy the Droid was an astromech featured in the comic Star Wars Tales number 1, notable for his ability to use the Force. While such things were almost always left to traditionally sentient beings in the Star Wars universe, this little machine, designated as R5-D4, somehow held a mastery of this complex and amorphous property, until his merciful decanonization, along with the rest of the Star Wars expanded universe. Skippy played a huge role in the original trilogy. He was the droid which Luke Skywalker originally purchased from the Jawas in A New Hope. However, Skippy sensed that the Alliance would only survive if Luke and R2-D2 were united. As a result, he self-destructed, which forced Luke to go back and buy the now famous droid duo from the Sandcrawler. This storyline is far beyond unnecessary, and given that the original Star Wars movie is full of continuity errors and logical fallacies, it seems odd that this particular scene would be explored in further detail. Nobody had previously given much thought as to why the first droid Luke purchased malfunctioned. Now that Skippy and his Force skills are no longer canon, no one will have to. It must be a rule among top 10 worst things in the EU lists to talk about Skippy. There must also be a rule that they completely missed the point of the story and what it actually meant to the rest of the EU. It makes me think that the people who make these lists don't actually read the stories that they're talking about, and just copy off other worst of the EU lists. If you didn't know, Star Wars Tales was a comic series which featured a bunch of short stories about Star Wars. Very few of them were actually canon, and the rest of it is just a bunch of silly stories that were not connected to the expanded universe. They are non-canon, or infinities as we called them back in the day. How do I know that? Skippy the Droid is in issue 1 of Star Wars Tales, which if you had read it, on the very first page, you were introduced to Pija Mobet, the in-universe owner of a Holo Emporium. He's talking about how in his shop, he has Holo stories about Mara Jade, Darth Vader, Qui-Gon Jinn, kind of implying that these events did occur, but when specifically talking about Skippy, he says, "That's not to say everything you'll find in my shop is, historically accurate. Some folks take liberties with their characters, others ignore potentially significant events, and still others speculate about what might have happened if something didn't occur when and where it should have, or vice versa for that matter. And then of course there's them hoo-ha stories, which make none of the pretense about tying in, so long as you're doubled over and cracking up. Here, this Skippy Holo is just the ticket if you're looking to laugh." I rest my case, and this had better be the last list I see that has Skippy on it. I've said it before. The EU must have been pretty great if one of the 10 worst stories you can pick from it wasn't even canon to begin with. Number 7. Luke Skywalker. Though there is a lot to like about Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy, there are a few more than quirky moments in them which makes their decanonization a little easier to bear. The plot of The Last Command, the series finale, is a bit all over the place, and almost makes the movie seem tame by comparison. The plot revolves around so-called Dark Jedi Jorah Sabaoth scheming to take Luke and Leia as his apprentices. If Vader and the Emperor couldn't do that, then there is little reason to believe that Sabaoth could. Though, that is beside the point. I'm a little confused as to what Tanner is referring to when he says the plot of The Last Command is all over the place. Also, Jorah Sabaoth is an arrogant Darksider who is used to either bending people to his will, or just outright killing them. He would at least try to sway Luke and Leia to the dark side. He was trying to rule the Empire, so I don't think he would just say, Oh, the Emperor tried to seduce Luke to the dark side and failed. Oh well, no point in trying then. And besides, Leia was pregnant with 4 sensitive twins. If Joruus controlled them from birth, then he could definitely brainwash them to be his apprentices. When Luke finally confronts the Stark Jedi, he reveals his secret weapon, a clone of Luke Skywalker replicated from the hand Vader severed on Bespin. Wielding the saber Luke lost in the same incident, the two duel for supremacy. This may have been a cool scene, were the novel not essentially jumping the shark at this point. Again, Tanner is saying The Last Command is bad, but he's not saying why. It's not the Luke clone apparently, because he just admitted it was a cool scene. What's worse is the clone was given the totally laughable moniker of Luke Skywalker. Imitation may be the highest form of flattery, but this is just horrible. Star Wars is full of trite moments, and it didn't need an added evil twin plot thread. So, like many worst of the EU lists that include the Luke clone, their main complaint seems to be the spelling of his name, the whole second U thing. It is silly, but as I've stated before, it was mainly spelled that way because people who are reading the novel would be able to tell the Lukes apart. And as for the evil twin plot thread, well, the Luke clone creation is thematically tied to the main villain of the Thrawn trilogy, Jorah Sabaoth, who was an evil clone himself. Much of Thrawn's plans in this trilogy, and in future novels, revolved around cloning, especially the cloning of Jedi, and killing the Luke clone helped Mara Jade nullify Palpatine's telepathic command to kill Luke Skywalker, which was a huge step for her character development, and for those reasons, I think having the Luke clone was really important for this story. Number 6. Jackson. Jackson the Rabbit is perhaps in contention with the likes of Jar Jar Binks and Boss Nass for worst Star Wars character ever created. A green Bugs Bunny lookalike, Jackson was a quippy, annoying smuggler whom accompanied Han and Chewie on a few adventures in the early Marvel Star Wars comics. Though these early issues were almost always completely nonsensical, Jackson and his insane misadventures may take the cake in terms of utter insanity. As a character, he is totally unlikable, combining the goofy, awkward appearance of Jar Jar Binks with the unfunny, offbeat wit of someone like Dash Rendar. Star Wars fans should count themselves lucky that this dumb misfire of a character never made it beyond the series' infancy. Sort of. The worst part is that Jackson, despite universal contempt from fans, made it in some form back into series canon. The green, furry rabbit creature made a brief appearance in the 2018 Star Wars adventure comic, The Lost Eggs of Livorno. While most of his stories aren't considered to be canon anymore, it's unfortunate to think that he's once again made a return to Star Wars. Okay, so if Jackson is part of the new canon now, why did you put him on here? The title is 10 Weird Things You're Glad Aren't Canon Anymore, and Jackson is canon, so it makes no sense to include him on here. I guess we'll just move on to number 5. Number 5. Impata Jay Hos Brand. The story of Impata Jay Hos Brand may end in hilarity, but he actually begins with a pretty interesting backstory. One of the few survivors of Palpatine's Jedi Purge near the end of the Clone Wars, Brand spent the years following the rise of the Empire on run from none other than Darth Vader himself. Vader nearly destroyed Brand in 10 BBY on one of Nar Shaddah's moons, though he was discovered and kept alive by the primitive Ganathan people. Grievously injured during his encounter with Vader, the Ganathans fitted Brand with a prosthetic body, which was little more than a metal sphere. As a result, he looked completely ridiculous and was difficult to take seriously. He was able to exact his revenge on the Empire, however. After the destruction of the second Death Star, Brand joined the new Jedi Order created by Luke Skywalker, whom he accompanied in a final battle with the resurrected Darth Sidious. Before his death, he managed to capture the Emperor's soul and drag it with him to the netherworld of the Force, from which he could never escape. Pretty cool story for a ball. So you think his backstory is interesting, and the fact that he helped take Palpatine down is cool. Your main gripe is with how he looks, which I can understand that part. Let's just keep in mind that his body was so damaged in his fight with Vader, he probably couldn't use much of it, and the species that rebuilt his cyborg body was fairly primitive, so they probably didn't have the technology to reconstruct his body to the extent of fully operable cybernetic limbs like Vader's. So his ball body was probably the best they could do. And while it does look silly, it's got a built-in lightsaber, which is pretty awesome. Number 4. The Sun Crusher. Disney may have gotten a bit carried away with Star Wars superweapons when they introduced the planetary, system-crushing Starkiller base in 2015's The Force Awakens. However, fans who found that to be overkill may need to brush up on their expanded universe lore, as it contains super weapons that are much more ridiculous. I'm not an expert on the new canon, but I think the complaints of the Starkiller base stem from the fact that it's a Death Star ripoff, rather than a new powerful superweapon. Multiple superweapons are well within the ability of the Empire to create. After all, if they can make hundreds of Star Destroyers, something like a scaled-down version of the Death Star would be super easy for them to make. The Suncrusher was a mysterious weapon which, despite being the size of an average fighter, was capable of destroying entire star systems by causing the system's star to go supernova. Somehow outclassing even the most deadly Star Destroyers, the Suncrusher was coated in layers of nearly impenetrable armor, and it could even sustain a blast from a Death Star super laser. Fans have expressed contempt for the Star Wars films and their reliance on superpowered MacGuffins, but the Suncrusher, had it appeared in any of the movies, would easily have been the worst offender. The first and second Death Star may have been intimidating, but this little ship goes far beyond that. Perhaps it will show up in Episode 9 as the ultimate unstoppable weapon to surpass the First Order's previously galaxy-destroying efforts. I doubt the Suncrusher will be in Episode 9. I don't believe that J.J. Abrams has that much knowledge of the Star Wars novels. Anyway, I think I get what Kevin J. Anderson was going with the idea of the Suncrusher. It subverts what we know about Star Wars superweapons. Instead of massive moon or planet-sized weapons, it's a dinky little starfighter, and yet it somehow ends up being more powerful than anything else. It's overpowered to the point of absurdity, and its ridiculous appearance disguises just how much of a serious threat it actually is. Though I can understand why you probably wouldn't want this in a future Star Wars story. I appreciate the Suncrusher, but one trilogy of books about it is enough for me. I'm glad the EU authors didn't keep trying to bring it back, or one-up each other with a whole fleet of Suncrushers or anything like that. This weird little ship caused enough trouble for the New Republic and the Empire, so it would make sense that no one would be rushing to recreate it. And the secrets of its construction were probably totally destroyed when head researcher Quizux had her mind wiped. Number 3. Belle Dorian the Hutt Jedi. Characters like Plo Koon and Kit Fisto may seem like dubious inductees into the Order of the Jedi, but they pale in comparison to Belle Dorian the Hutt, a Jedi Knight and likely the most embarrassing aspect of the Jedi Order, save for their near extermination at the hands of Darth Sidious. How are Plo Koon and Kit Fisto dubious inductees? Because they're aliens? Are you being racist? Because this sounds like it could be good Imperial propaganda against the Jedi. Belle Dorian the Hutt was a Force-sensitive Hutt from Nal Hutta who was taken as a Jedi Padawan sometime around 400 BBY. Eventually graduating to the rank of Jedi Knight, Belle Dorian was corrupted by the dark side of the Force during a mission on the planet Nam Choriosis, over which he proceeded to rule for many years. Renouncing his position as a Jedi, he enslaved much of the planet's population, and lived in decadence for many years. Surviving Order 66, Belle Dorian was eventually brought to the attention of Luke Skywalker, who along with his sister Leia Organa, traveled to the planet to end his reign. Initially captured by the Hutt's followers, Leia was able to free herself and defeat Belle Dorian in a lightsaber duel. All of this would make for some pretty awesome fanfiction, were the antagonist not a giant space slug. Again with calling it fanfiction. I think the concept of a Hutt Jedi is inherently fine, and I have to give more credit to the EU authors for not overdoing it. In the history of the galaxy, we only have one Hutt in the Jedi Order, which makes sense to me. Belle Dorian is probably considered an abnormality in his species. Not too many Force-sensitive Hutts that we know of, especially when you compare it to the human or humanoid species that we see represented in the Jedi Order over and over. But keep in mind, Opal Rancistides was also kind of strange looking with his snake-like body, and he was on the Jedi Council, but if you had a problem with Plo Koon and Kit Fisto, you probably wouldn't be a fan of him either. Anyway, a Hutt Jedi makes complete sense to me. As a one-time thing, I'm okay with it. I can see at least one point in the Jedi's history they would try to recruit a Hutt to be a Jedi Knight. Probably just to see if they could. And I'm sure they had their reservations at the time, given Hutt society and all that. And it turns out he fell to the dark side, so... whoops. Number 2. Mount Sorrow. Another product of the horrendous Marvel Star Wars comics, Mount Sorrow just barely escapes the infamous title of worst thing about the generally pretty awful expanded universe. Mount Sorrow was a sentient mountain on the planet of Endor, which, through the subject of Ewok superstition and legend, somehow found its way into Star Wars canon, featured in much maligned comic Ewok 7, The Perilous Laughing Spell. The only readers able to genuinely enjoy this story must have been extremely young, so now Tanner's calling the expanded universe generally pretty awful, I guess implying that these items on this list are the rule and not the exception. But Oh well, that's like your opinion, man. You are probably correct that these comics were aimed at young kids. Much of the Ewok-oriented stories in the EU involve Ewoks dealing with superstition and legends. Mount Sorrow is not unique in this regard, and if you wanted to, I'm sure you could have filled this top 10 list with stuff that exclusively shows up in the Ewok comics. We got ice demons, thorn monsters, rainbow bridges. Admittedly, things that would be pretty silly anywhere in Star Wars other than the Ewok material. However, you could also argue that other weird things do show up in parts of the Star Wars galaxy. So while a depressed mountain with healing tears is strange, it could possibly exist in the Star Wars universe. I have a feeling that the only reason Mount Sorrow specifically shows up on these worst of EU lists is that a lot of them are copying off each other. And Mount Sorrow, like Skippy and Jackson, keep appearing on these lists. The Living Mountain was famous for its healing tears, which it uses to heal the Ewok poet Tebow. Though in a constant state of depression, the mountain is pretty picky about who it will cry on, and it takes the length of an entire comic book to get him to help the poor Ewok out. This goes without saying, but this is a storyline which shouldn't have come within a light year of the Star Wars franchise. George Lucas may have had some pretty bad decisions in later years considering the brand he helped establish, but none were as bad as Mount Sorrow. Funny you should say that, because there are living mountains that show up in the new canon. Not as silly as Mount Sorrow, of course, but that was aimed at younger kids. I'm sure even with the new continuity, you'll see silly stuff aimed at children too. Should that stay a light year away from the franchise too? I'd argue no, because Star Wars should appeal to all age groups, whether it's canon or legends. Number 1. Waru. Waru's story makes very little sense and is at the heart of the universally trashed Crystal Star novel by Vonda and McIntyre. For starters, Crystal Star centers around the idea that a Jedi can lose his or her connection to the Force by watching a star slowly crystallize. This unfortunately happened to Luke Skywalker, who then takes it upon himself to join a cult started by an extra-dimensional gelatin monster in an effort to reclaim his powers. Waru was extradited from his original dimension through the efforts of Justice Henther, an Imperial officer who once served as an apprentice to Darth Vader. The gang of Han, Leia, Leia's children, C-3PO, and R2-D2 all quest to grant Waru's wish of returning to his home dimension, and to free Luke from the weird cult he joined. This is, needless to say, a terrible premise for a Star Wars story, and it far suppresses the likes of oft-lauded clunkers like The Phantom Menace, the Aftermath trilogy, and the Children of the Jedi novel. Barring it from any true association with a beloved sci-fi franchise, Waru's tale may be some of the worst fiction ever published, period. Yeah, The Crystal Star is a very weird book. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's some of the worst fiction ever published, but it's pretty much universally agreed to be bottom of the barrel when it comes to the expanding universe. Now, there are parts of the story I did like. The parts with the Solo children and Tigris were fine. The main part of the book that people took issue with was with Waru. He was pretty out there, even when it comes to Star Wars. Having this crazy blob creature from another dimension that feeds on the Anti-Force, I mean, maybe if other authors expanded on it, it could make sense. Like, I had an idea that instead of being from an alternate dimension, he could be retconned to be some long-lost Rakatan technology, similar to the mother entity from the Riptide novel. Waru feeds on the Force, could be considered a combination between flesh and technology, and even the way space is different on the inside of him could be elements of being Rakatan technology. Maybe Luke was only speculating that Waru was from another dimension. But at this point, I'm into headcanon territory, and I think we all just want to forget this book for the most part. But as weird as he is, I can kind of accept Waru. My issue was with Luke's characterization in this book. He was way too trusting of Waru, when he had every reason not to be. In conclusion, I disagreed with most of Tanner's choices on this list, with maybe the exception of Mount Sorrow or Waru, and even those could be explained better or expanded on in more supplementary material to make it fit more with the rest of the expanded universe. I don't think there's anything wrong with the Hutt Jedi, the Sun Crusher, or Bran's body. Jackson's pretty silly as a big green anthropomorphic bunny, but he's in the new canon as well, so you can't use him as a way to make the new canon look better. The complaints about the Luke clone stem from nitpicking his name. Skippy was a story made just for fun that doesn't connect to anything else. Chewbacca died a heroic noble death that was worthy of his character, and the worst part about Masters of Teräs Käsi was its gameplay, and not its story. Once again, everyone has a right to their own opinion on what they think is good, bad, or weird when it comes to the EU. I appreciate the good parts, I tolerate the bad, and the weird things, depending on what they are, can give the universe a special charm which may have been what attracted me to the EU in the first place. I know the expanded universe can be pretty weird, but the new canon can be just as weird, or even weirder. I'm okay with weird or silly things in Star Wars. I think most of us are, since after all, we accept that this universe has a few individuals who can shoot lightning from their fingers. All I want is there to be a logical consistency that is adequately explained.